Okay, so yes, we're continuing our series. We're coming towards the end of this series, which has been called Daring Discipleship. It's been about the journey of discipleship, and we looked at what it means to be a searcher, to be a believer, and then last week Andrea taught us very challengingly on what it means to be a disciple. If you weren't here or you missed it for any reason, it's on YouTube. I really recommend that you listen to it. And this morning we are thinking about what it means to respond to Jesus' commission to go and make disciples. How can we be disciple-making disciples? And I want to start this morning by telling you a story that happened when I was preparing for the last talk I did a few weeks ago. And in that talk, two of the main passages that I used were Luke 15, which is the story of the lost son, and Matthew 4, which is when Jesus calls the first disciples. And I've been writing away in the mornings now that all three children are at school. I have these lovely, peaceful mornings of solitude, and I've been writing all morning, and I walked down to school to get the boys, and on the way I overheard a conversation between two guys, and they were quite far apart from each other, so that's why I was able to overhear them. I wasn't walking along like this. I overheard them, and I only heard one line as I walked past them, and the line I heard was, "Yes, the prodigal son returns." And as I heard those words, it was amazing, because I just felt this real sense of affirmation or confirmation from God that yes, you're on the right track. As you're writing this talk and you're writing about Luke 15 and the prodigal son, you're on the right track. And it was amazing to overhear those words and have that sense. And then I can't remember if it was the same day or the next day, but it was that week. And Ellie had been given a Bible at GB on that Monday. It was her first grown-up Bible. It was an NIV, New Testament and Psalms. She's had lots of kids' Bibles, but it was her first grown-up one. And she'd been sort of just reading it, bits and pieces, as she had free moments during the week. And it was bedtime, and we were halfway through the bedtime routine. I don't think Rick was there, so he must have been, maybe it was a Thursday night, and he was here, and I was getting all tidied up, and Ellie was sitting on the sofa reading her NIV, and I was going over to start reading the bedtime story to the big tune. Benji was in bed, and she said to me, "Mum, can you read me the next bit of my Bible? Can you read it to me?" Now, I would love to say that my answer to my daughter saying, "Can you read the Bible to me?" is always yes, but I have to say that when I'm that close to bedtime, it's like a marathon runner getting to the last 100 yards, and my eye is on the goal. My eyes firmly on, children all being in bed. But thankfully, in that moment, I did say yes. And I sat down next to her on the sofa, and she said, "This is where I've got to." And she put her finger on the page, the exact little section of the chapter, and she put her finger on the bit where Jesus calls the first disciples, and that's where she had got to. And again, that sense of yes, Ruth, you're on the right track with this talk, it was amazing. And so then a couple of days later again, we were praying at bedtime, Eleanor and I, and we got to the end of the prayer, and she said to me, "Oh, Mum, praying to God is a little bit like writing him a letter, isn't it?" So I thought, and I said, "Yeah, I suppose it is really." And I said, "Actually, as you get to know him more, you learn to hear his voice, and then it becomes more like a conversation." And then I was able to say to her, "Actually, already you have heard God's voice," because it makes me emotional, because it's my favourite moment so far being a parent. I was able to say to her, you have heard God's voice, because when you asked me the other day to read that bit of the Bible to you, that was God giving me a message that I had heard him, and I was preparing the right talk. And she was like, "Wow," the wonder on her face was amazing. She was like, So Mum, God said to me, "Eleanor, tell your mother," "tell your mother to read that bit of the Bible." I was like, "Yeah, exactly." So it's really amazing. So that's what I want to start by talking about this morning. Hopefully less emotionally. Because Andrea taught us last week that a disciple is somebody who listens to God's voice and then does what he says. So if we're going to make disciples, then surely it stands to reason that we help people to hear God's voice. And so to help us with that, we're going to look at the example of Eli and Samuel. So it's going to come up on the screen. There we go. So This is 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1 to 19. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel served the Lord by assisting Eli. Now in those days, messages from the Lord were very rare, and visions were quite uncommon. One night, Eli, who was almost blind by now, had gone to bed. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was sleeping in the tabernacle near the ark of God. Suddenly the Lord had called out, "Samuel." "Yes," Samuel replied. "What is it?" He got up and ran to Eli. "Here I am. Did you call me?" "I didn't call you," Eli replied. "Go back to bed." So he did. Then the Lord called out again, "Samuel." Again, Samuel got up and went to Eli. "Here I am. Did you call me?" "I did not call you, my son," Eli said. "Go back to bed." Samuel did not yet know the Lord because he had never had a message from the Lord before. So the Lord called a third time, and once more Samuel got up and went to Eli. "Here I am. Did you call me?" Then Eli realized it was the Lord who was calling the boy. So he said to Samuel, "Go and lie down again. And if someone calls again, say, 'Speak, Lord, your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went back to bed, and the Lord came and called as before, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel replied, "Speak, your servant is listening." Then the Lord said to Samuel, "I am about to do a shocking thing in Israel. I am going to carry out all my threats against Eli and his family from beginning to end. I have warned him that judgment is coming upon his family forever because his sons are blaspheming God and he hasn't disciplined them. So I have vowed that the sins of Eli and his sons will never be forgiven by sacrifices or offerings." Samuel stayed in bed until morning and then got up and opened the doors of the tabernacle as usual. He was afraid to tell Eli what the Lord had said to him. But Eli called out to him, "Samuel, my son." "Here I am," Samuel replied. "What did the Lord say to you? Tell me everything, and may God strike you and even kill you if you hide anything from me." So Samuel told Eli everything. He didn't hold anything back. "It is the Lord's will," Eli replied. "Let him do what he thinks best." As Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him, and everything Samuel said proved to be reliable. Okay, so Samuel is in the temple because he was a longed-for child, a prayed-for child, and when his parents conceived him, his mum made this promise to God that when he was old enough, she would dedicate him back to the Lord, and he would go and serve in the temple with the priests. So that's why he's there. And at this stage, he's still quite young, he's still a boy. And it says in verse 7, let's have a look at verse 7. Samuel did not yet know the Lord because he had never had a message from the Lord before. Now, I have read this passage a lot in the last couple of weeks especially, and I noticed a really amazing thing. Maybe everyone else already knew this, but at the very start this morning I said we want to help people learn to hear the voice of God, but actually this passage shows us that we don't need to, because Samuel had never had a message from God before. God had never spoken to Samuel before, and yet he has no problem hearing God's voice. He can hear God. He responds, but he just doesn't know that it's God who's speaking to him. He doesn't need help hearing God, he just needs help identifying God's voice. And I think when we are helping people to listen to God, we don't need to teach them how to hear his voice, because everyone can already do that. We just need to teach them to identify his voice. Eleanor had heard God's voice and she had responded to him. But I think if I had asked her, between her asking me to read that bit of the Bible and then me explaining to her a few days later that had been God, I think if I asked her in that little gap, "Has God ever spoken to you?" she would have said no, because she didn't know that he had. And I think that very often when we think that God doesn't speak to us or he hasn't spoken to us, actually I think that he has, but we just haven't realised it's been him. And that's what happens in this story too. In verses 5 and 6, look, in verse 5, God calls Samuel for the first time. He goes to Eli, and Eli says, "No, I didn't call you." And then in verse 6, the Lord called out again, "Samuel," and again Samuel got up and went to Eli. "Here I am, did you call me?" "I didn't call you, my son." Eli said, "Go back to bed." Even, Samuel doesn't realise that God is speaking, which is fair enough. He's never heard God before, but neither does Eli. And Eli is a priest. He's an experienced man of God. Fair enough, he is asleep. And when I am woken up by my children in the middle of the night, messages from God are not the first thing on my mind. Usually I'm thinking, if I just lie here and pretend I'm still asleep, then maybe Rick will get up. You all do that too. Even Eli doesn't get it straight away. But what's God's response to that? When Samuel and Eli both don't realise that it's him that's calling, what's his response? Look at verses 6 and verse 8. The Lord called out again, Samuel. And then in verse 8, so the Lord called a third time. He just calls again. When they don't realise that it's him, he just calls again. And sometimes I think we have a bit of a tendency to think of hearing God's voice as like a test that we have to pass. I actually had a little flashback this week to my French oral exams. Anybody remember doing oral exams for languages? For some reason we always had to go to the Scout Hut for ours, I don't know why. So I always have this warm, woody smell when I think about doing the French oral exam. But do you remember your teacher standing at the front of the room and they put the cassette tape in, just to show my age, and you listen to the words and your teachers are grimacing at you, please get this right. And you're there like a rabbit in the headlights, trying so hard to work out what's being said to you and then work out how to phrase your response. Or I was thinking as well about the mystery voice competitions on the radio, where a celebrity or a few celebrities say a word each in a sentence and you have to phone in and guess who's saying it. Sometimes I think we can think that God's a bit like that he's like the French teacher at the front of the room, are they going to get this right? Or the DJ, wrong answer. But God isn't a radio DJ and he's not a French teacher. He is just our dad. And he just wants to speak to us, and so he keeps calling, like he does in this passage. And eventually Eli wakes up enough to realise it's God calling Samuel. In the message of verse 8 it says, it dawned on him. I like that. He tunes in, he rubs the sleep out of his eyes, and he tunes in. And he's tuned in not just to what God is doing in him, but also to what he's doing in Samuel. And at the start of the year we did a mini-series at Coast Women called She Speaks, which when we took it in turn, some of us to share our story, and the rest of us listened to the person sharing, and we listened to God for that person. We learned to listen to God and for what he was saying for that person that was speaking. And Samuel does that. Samuel's tuned in here, or Eli's tuned in here to what God is doing in Samuel. But this is really important. He doesn't listen instead of Samuel. He doesn't say, right, leave it to me. Okay, I'm the experienced one here. You're just this young guy. God's going to give me the message to pass on to you. Because if you were writing this story from an earthly perspective, wouldn't you write it that way? Wouldn't you say, right, Eli's the experienced man of God, he's mature, he's experienced in leadership, he's going to get the message for the young apprentice. That's the way we would write it, but it's not the way that God does it, because his kingdom is an upside down kingdom. So Eli doesn't take over, but instead he gives Samuel the confidence to listen to God himself. He doesn't over-prescribe, he doesn't give him a 10-step plan to follow. He just says, Samuel, that's God. When you hear him again, just say, I'm listening. And then in verse 16 and 17, he follows it up. So the next morning, he says to him, he calls him Samuel, my son. And Samuel says, here I am. And then Eli says in verse 17, thanks David, what did the Lord say to you? Tell me everything. He follows it up. He doesn't just tell him what to do, how to identify God's voice and how to listen, but he follows it up. He trusts that Samuel will have heard God, will have got a message from God, and that in itself would have been really confidence boosting for Samuel. And he goes through the whole process. And that's what we need to do. Just because now I said to Ellie once, oh, that was God speaking to you, it's not like she never needs any more instruction from anyone about that. She does, she will. But I think sometimes we think that following up with people or asking them what did God say is putting them on the spot, but that's not what it's about. Andrew used this phrase when he was introducing this series. He referred to this passage and he said, Eli nurtured Samuel in the ways of God. When we follow up with people, that's what we are doing. We're not putting them on the spot. It's really important to do that. And then in verse 18, Eli responded to what God said to Samuel, and he responded really humbly. It is the Lord's will, Eli replied. Let him do what he thinks is best. I wonder if it was tempting for him, having got that message, which was a really tough message to hear. I wonder if it was tempting for him to say, do you know what, Samuel? That's the first time you've heard God. I reckon you got that wrong. I don't think God would have given you that message for me. I don't know, maybe it wasn't. But he doesn't say that anyway. He says, it is the Lord's will. He responded humbly. And I want to say one more thing about this passage before we move on from it. Even though Samuel hadn't heard God's voice before, he had been living in the temple, so he would have been used to that, he was in that environment. He would have been maybe used to other people hearing from God. That would have been a familiar experience for him. But actually, it wasn't, because if we go back to verse 1, in those days, messages from the Lord were very rare, and visions were quite uncommon. Samuel had not only not heard from God himself, but he wasn't in an environment where he was used to that. That wouldn't have been a familiar thing for him. But sometimes I think we can have this misconception that you need to be experienced in the ways of God, or at least familiar with them, that you need to have been in church or around church for a while in order for God to speak to you. And absolutely, experience helps us to tune in quicker. When I met Rick's dad, who is one of my favourite people in the world, but when I met him, it took me a while to tune into him. His accent is unique. I mean, when my friends come over from England, they're like looking at me like, help, I have no idea what he's talking about, and he's speaking more or less the same language. It took me a while to tune in. Experience helps us to tune in more quickly. But this account of Eli and Samuel shows us that God does not require you to gain experience. He does not require you to be qualified in any way for him to speak to you. He is your Father, your heavenly Dad, and he is lovingly and patiently calling your name. And there are loads of ways that he does that, because when we are tuned into him, he can use anything to speak to us. He used my neighbour and he used Ellie. Neither of them knew at the time that they were being used by God to speak to me, but they were. And actually, even this morning, Andrea had that experience where she thought Andy said one thing and he didn't. But that was enough for her to know, oh, that's God. He wants me to read this morning because somebody here needs to hear that. Once God spoke to me through some love hearts, through messages on love hearts. I was going to tell you the story, but it'll take too long. Some people would say that that's just a coincidence, or that's just my imagination. And when we get a message from God, you know, they don't come with a certificate floating down from the sky, said by God. But they do come with a promise, and they do come with a choice. And the promise is the same one that Andrea referred to last week. The promise that God made to his people through the prophet Joel, and then through Peter again in the book of Acts. I think it's on the slide. In the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy, your young men will see visions, and your old men will dream dreams. In those days, and when Peter was talking about the last days, he was talking and saying we're in them, okay? So that's 2,000 years ago. If they were the last days, these are definitely the last days. In those days, in these days, I will pour out my spirit, even on my servants, men and women alike, and they will prophesy. That's his promise to me, and that's his promise to each of us, and it comes with a choice. Do I believe him? Andy spoke a few weeks ago about what it means to be a believer, and he said, believing is opening the door to everything that Jesus has for us. I love it. I love that image. And it's true the first time we believe, and it's true every time we believe another of God's promises. Do I believe that God's Spirit is poured out on me? Yes, I do. Do I believe that I will prophesy, or to put it simply, that God will speak through me? Yes, I do. And so then suddenly the door is opened, and my voice is no longer full of strange coincidences about my neighbour calling something out, or Ellie asking me to read, or Andrea mishearing Andy, or the messages on the love hearts. My life is no longer full of these strange coincidences, but it is now full of God's voice. It comes with responsibility. It doesn't mean that anything that comes into my head I can say, oh, that's from God. Andrea reminded us last week, and it's vitally important that we always remember this, that God will never say anything to our hearts that he hasn't already said in the Bible. So we listen humbly and we grow in experience. But I think we all have those moments. And if we thought about it for a minute, we could probably all identify them in our recent lives where something has happened and we thought, oh, that's weird. And we have a choice in those moments to think, is that a coincidence or is that the voice of God? My mother-in-law couldn't sleep the other night, which isn't a common experience for her. And while she was awake, she felt God put a message in her heart to share with some people. And then a couple of days later, I think it was just maybe in her daily reading, but I'm not sure. Anyway, she came across this verse. Psalm 16, verse 7. I will bless the Lord who guides me. Even at night, my heart instructs me. And she had a choice in that moment to believe or not believe that verse was a confirmation for her that the message she had received at night from God was actually a message from God and not just a coincidence and not just her imagination. We have those moments and we have a choice. And as we get to know God's voice, we become more familiar with it. And we will realise that God speaks to us in all kinds of moments and all kinds of places because nowhere is off limits to him. And those moments that I shared this morning happen during the school run and they happen during the bedtime routine. Both of those things happen every single day. They're really normal moments in my life, but that's the beauty of us opening the door. Because Revelation chapter 3 verse 20 says this. This is Jesus speaking through John. Listen, I stand at the door and knock. If any hear my voice and open the door, I will come into their house and eat with them and they will eat with me. I will come into their house. He comes in. Not us knocking and he lets us in, but he's knocking and he comes in. We let him into our lives. He comes in with his love and he comes in with his presence and he comes in with his voice. And I think sometimes we think of life with Jesus as being like completely separate from normal life or from the life that we had before we knew him. And sometimes there are elements of life that we have to leave behind when we come to know Jesus. But this verse shows us that it's he who comes into our lives, our ordinary everyday lives, and he inhabits them and he redeems them and he speaks into them and he breathes into them. And we live in a culture that's really quick to replace things, don't we? I was actually thinking about the P&O thing. We live in a culture that's really quick to replace hundreds of workers. We live in a culture that's quick to replace things, wardrobes, cars, people. But we love and are loved by a God who does not replace us, but instead he redeems us and renews us. He doesn't make all new things, he makes all things new. He comes into us and makes what is old new. And so in order to be disciples who make disciples, we want to help people identify the voice of God and we want to help them open the door to the voice of God in their lives. And then we want to help them respond to what he says. Now, obviously, that's a huge topic, and we're all going to spend the rest of our lives trying to do that more and trying to do that better. But I just think a key part of that, and I think it is a bit like a key because I think it unlocks something in us. A key part of that is, a key part of being a disciple, I think, is working out how God has gifted you and what he's called you to. And so when we're thinking about making disciples, we want to think, how can we help other people do that? How can we help other people identify how God has gifted them? And recently I was trying to put into words what it was like to be a part of this church in particular. And what came to my mind was a picture of the church as a garden. Not a garden like ours, for anyone who's seen it, which mainly has potential, but a garden like a National Trust garden. Do you know the sort of thing I mean? It's got lovely meandering paths and it's got trees and you go around corners and oh, that's a lovely surprise, and the beds are beautiful and the edges are beautiful. Water features. It's designed and it's created. And there's a verse in Isaiah about a garden, and this is a promise from God, and the previous verses in this chapter are all about how to live as a follower of Jesus, and it says that if we live this way, you'll be like a well-watered garden, a gurgling spring that never runs dry. And as I prepared for this talk, this picture came back to me, because we are all plants in this garden, okay? From seedlings in the potting shed to full, mature, fruit-bearing trees. We are all plants in this garden, and we all have a place here, and we are all growing here. But we are also all gardeners in this garden. The Bible refers a few times to Jesus or God being a gardener, and he has called us to partner with him. So if he's the head gardener, then we're like his apprentices. And some of us are more experienced than others just because we've been here longer, but no one is more qualified than anyone else. We are all apprentices. And as this picture came back to my mind, I thought about all the jobs that are involved in creating a garden like this and maintaining a garden like this. First of all, you need garden designers. You need ideas people. Let's have a path going that way. Let's have a bed over here. Let's have a ministry that does this. Let's have a new thing. Let's have a new kind of biscuit like this. We could do this to welcome people. Let's do this for the kids. We need ideas people. We need ground preparers. People who will dig new beds, who will turn hard ground into ground with potential. People who prayer walk. People who not only have ideas but can share them. People who can go to council planning meetings and get things passed. We need soil nourishers. People who will pray and weep. And often those people see that they're doing it for future fruit. We need seed sowers. We need people who will plant things, who will try new things, knowing that not everything will come up, but that's okay. Let's give it a go. I was thinking about the testimonies you hear of people who say, do you know, this thing happened in my life, and all of a sudden I remembered what so-and-so at Sunday school had said to me 20 years before. Those people were planting seeds, and 20 years later they bear fruit. We need waterers, people who will encourage, who will pray with, who will cheer people on. We need weeders, who will help us identify wrong thinking in our lives, who will help us identify where we have believed a lie and help us pull that out. And we need pruners, very few trusted, respected people. This is not a job for everybody in your life, maybe just your pastors. Trusted, respected people who can lovingly and gently call out the parts of our lives that are harming us or harming others and need to be changed or removed. And we need season changers, people who can look ahead to the next thing while this thing is still happening. Because if we didn't have that, we would all be caught out all the time. Oh, what are we going to do next? We need people that can look ahead. We need people who know when a plant needs extra protection. We need people who know when it needs to come into shelter, when it's too soon to plant it out. I wanted to go and get all these pots the other day because it was sunny and fill them with lovely plants. I water plants for about 2 weeks and then I ignore them for the rest of the year. Thankfully, being a spiritual gardener doesn't mean you have to be a great actual gardener. But my mother-in-law said to me, Ruth, it's too soon. There'll still be frost. We need people who know that. We need people who know it's too soon for that plant. We need people who know when a plant needs extra support, it needs to be held up. We need people who know where the right place in the garden is for a plant. There are so many jobs in a garden that translate into jobs or ministries in the church, both when we are gathered here together on a Sunday and when we are dispersed and going about our normal lives every day. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 says, God's various gifts are handed out everywhere, but they all originate in God's Spirit. God's various ministries are carried out everywhere, but they all originate in God's Spirit. God's various expressions of power are in action everywhere, but God himself is behind it all. Each person is given something to do that shows who God is. Everyone gets in on it. Everyone benefits. All kinds of things are handed out by the Spirit and all kinds of people, to all kinds of people. The variety is wonderful. Part of our job as disciple-making disciples is helping people see what God has equipped them for. Each person, it says there, is given something to do that shows who God is. We have the privilege of showing people what God has equipped them for, what job he has given them. And we have the privilege of showing them how he has equipped them for it. Because in this garden we have at our disposal shovels, forks, hose, trowels, watering cans, trellises, secateurs, polytunnels. I say that like I know about gardens. I know about polytunnels because Jill put some on Facebook the other day. But we have all those things. And 1 Peter chapter 4 says, God has given each of you a gift from his great variety, there's that word again, of spiritual gifts. Use them well to serve one another. Because we are so much more effective at doing what he has called us to do when we use what he has given us. Can you imagine trying to dig a new flower bed from hard ground with your hands? And then somebody comes along and says, did you know that you can use a shovel? Wouldn't that be transforming in the job you are trying to do? I can still remember where I was the first time that somebody identified a spiritual gift that God had given me. I was in my late teens and somebody said to me, I can't remember any of the context, but somebody said to me, you know, Ruth, God has given you the gift of encouragement. And it was amazing. It was an amazing moment because, first of all, God has bothered to give me a gift. Like, what? Amazing. God made the world and he's given me a gift. But also it gave me a real sense of purpose. Not that I suddenly was like forcing my way into situations and like insisting on encouraging people at all costs, but it made me more intentional about looking for opportunities to encourage people. It gave me a sense of purpose. It is such a privilege to get to show people the tools that God has put in their hands. Let's be those people. Let's be on the lookout for the calling and the gifts of God in each other, and then let's tell each other when we see them. Because you can see it in them, but they might not be able to see it in themselves. So let's tell each other. It's so life-giving. And then our challenge is to give people the space and the freedom and the opportunity and the encouragement to use those tools, because the only way to get better at using a tool is to practice with it. And sometimes it's hard to do that. Sometimes it's a risk. You know, Andy and Andrea take a risk every time they let me up here, because I may say something that I don't say it in the way they would say it. And it's a risk, and they don't know what's going to come out of my mouth. It's like baking a cake with a child. You want to jump in and crack the eggs for them, as you see it going all over the kitchen. But the only way to grow an experience is to do it. And of course, we don't abandon people to it, as Eli and Samuel showed us. We go through the whole process with them. We wait until the cake is out of the oven and all the egg is cleared up. But we don't do it for each other, we do it with each other. Because Andy said it so beautifully in the introduction to this series, and I talked about it in my last talk. I think I'm going to talk about it forever because I love it. Words inform, but action transforms. I love it so much. And the lovely thing is that as we are transformed, that rubs off on those around us. Ephesians 4. He makes the whole body fit together perfectly. As each part does its own special work, it helps the other parts grow, so that the whole body is healthy and growing and full of love. In a normal garden, that's the end of the verse. I was going to read on as if that was the verse. The whole body is healthy and growing and full of love. In a normal garden, plants fight for nutrients, don't they? They fight for growth. If one plant is thriving, it maybe means that the other ones around it aren't, because it's taking all the goodness out of the soil. But the beautiful thing about this garden is that when one of us thrives, we all thrive. As each part does its own special work, it helps the other parts grow. As we grow, we help each other grow. And I'm going to finish now, and I just want to look at the next verse in the Isaiah 58 passage that follows on from being a well-watered garden. You'll use the old rubble of past lives to build anew. Rebuild the foundations from out of your past. You'll be known as those who can fix anything. Restore old ruins, rebuild and renovate. Make the community livable again. And just when I was preparing for today, when I was writing, I had a sense that maybe there are people here this morning who have heard God's call on their lives, who have opened the door to his voice, and you know how he's gifted you, and you know what tools he's given you, and you've used them. But something happened maybe, or it just didn't go the way that you thought it would go, and so you put them down again. Or maybe you doubted that you had those tools in the first place, and so you've closed the door to him using that part of you. And I just had a very strong sense when I was writing this that Jesus is knocking on the door this morning. He wants to come in to what is already there, how he created you. You know, those things that we're good at. We so often think of them just like, the list of spiritual gifts that we find in the Bible. But there's so much more that he's given us to use. The things that we are just good at in our personality. He has given you your personality. He wants to come into what is already there, to what he has already given you. And he wants to pick up the tools that you put down and he wants to put them back in your hands so that you can rebuild and take the old rubble and build anew with it. So I'm going to pray and we're going to sing and we're going to take some time to listen to what God is doing and respond to him. God, it's just so incredible that you love us, and it's so incredible that you want to speak to us and you are speaking to us. You are the mighty, all-powerful, creating God, and we are just little old us. But God, that's why you made us. You made us for a relationship with you. You made us for conversation with you. Two-way conversation. And so God, we want to hear your voice. We want to be able to identify it. We want to listen to what you are saying to us, to what you are calling out over our lives. We want to listen to your song over us. And we want to respond to you. Because we know that whatever you call us to is the best thing that we can ever have. And we know that what you give us to do what you've called us to do with is the best thing we can ever have, to do those jobs, to live that life. God, I pray right now, Holy Spirit, I pray right now that you will come in your power, in your gentle tenderness, and you will tune our ears, you will tune our hearts so that we can identify your voice. There are things that you want to say to each of us this morning, every single person that is here. We say, come. We are listening. Speak, God, because your servants are listening. We are ready to receive you, God. Let's stand.